In the autumn of 1866, on the vast, wind-scoured plains of the Nebraska Territory, Alara McLeod was engaged in an act of profound foolishness. Or so it seemed to every pair of eyes that watched her. She worked with a quiet, almost reverent intensity, her hands moving with a practiced economy that belied the strangeness of her task. Instead of a bucket of mud, clay, and grass, the standard, time-tested chinking for a log cabin, her materials were heaps of dry, brittle lichen. She had spent weeks gathering it from the shaded hollows and north-facing bark of the few cottonwoods that dared to grow along the creek beds. Now, with a small wooden mallet and a shaped piece of hickory, she was packing the grayish-green fluff into every gap and seam of her new cabin. She wedged it in, layer upon layer, yet compressing the fibrous material until it formed a dense, springy seal between the rough-hewn logs. To her neighbors, it looked like she was stuffing her home with tinder and mouse nesting. Silas Croft, the man who had overseen the raising of nearly every structure in their small settlement, would stop his wagon on the rutted track just to watch. He'd shake his head, a look of genuine pity on his face. He saw a grieving widow, a woman from the misty hills of Scotland, utterly ignorant of the prairie's hard truths. He saw a home that would be scoured by the winter wind, a home that would bleed heat until its occupants froze. Her project earned a name, spoken first in whispers at the trading post, then in open jest: the Highland Nest. They all thought they knew what winter was. They thought their methods were sound, but they did not understand the nature of the cold that was coming, and they could not possibly comprehend what Alara McLeod, with her bags of dried moss and her memories of an older, colder land, knew about the physics of survival. What did this quiet outsider understand about insulation that every experienced frontiersman had missed entirely? Before we uncover the principles behind her strange technique, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for more stories of forgotten wisdom and incredible engineering. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It's amazing to see how far these histories travel. The enemy in that part of the world was not the snow. It was not the ice. It was the wind. The settlers had a name for it: the razor. It was a constant, a relentless force that blew from the northwest from November until March, a solid wall of motion that seemed to have no origin and no end. It was a wind that didn't just make you cold, it actively stole warmth. It stripped heat from living bodies, from livestock, from the very logs of a man's home. To fight this enemy, they relied on two things: a roaring fire and a solid wall. The fire was a hungry god, demanding a tithe of precious hardwood that had to be hauled for miles. The wall was the problem. A log cabin, for all its rugged appearance, is not a solid structure. It is a collection of logs with gaps in between. The battle for survival was fought and lost in those gaps. The universal solution was chinking, made from a mixture of clay-rich mud, dried grass, and sometimes a little hog hair or lime if a man was fortunate. Yes, the logic was simple. The materials were free and abundant. When wet, the mixture was pliable, easy to smear into the gaps with a trowel or a broad knife. It dried into a hard, cement-like barrier that, for a few weeks in the autumn, seemed to do the job perfectly. But it was a flawed and treacherous solution. The prairie was a land of extremes. The green logs of a new cabin would shrink as they cured. The brutal temperature swings from a mild, sunny afternoon to a night of bitter cold caused the logs to expand and contract. The mud chinking did not. It was rigid. It was brittle. First, hairline cracks would appear. The wind, with its insidious, probing fingers, would find these cracks and worry them wider. Then, a chunk would fall out inside the cabin, showering the floor with dirt and letting in a spear of frigid air. A man would spend half his winter mixing new mud on his hearth, trying to patch the holes while the blizzard raged outside. It was a constant losing battle. The chinking absorbed moisture, and on the coldest nights, that dampness would transmit the killing cold directly through the walls, coating the interior with a fine, glittering layer of frost. The suffering was a quiet, accepted fact of life. It was the sight of families huddled around a stove, wrapped in every blanket they owned, yet still shivering. It was the sound of the wind whistling through a dozen invisible cracks in the dead of night. It was the taste of smoke that filled the cabin because the fire had to be kept roaring so high. It was the sight of ink freezing in its well, of water barrels turning to solid ice indoors, of a mother waking to find a rime of ice on the woolen blanket covering her sleeping child. This was the reality of the conventional wisdom. Alara MacLeod had known a different kind of cold. She was raised in the Scottish Highlands, a land not of dry, searing freezes, but of a damp, penetrating chill carried on winds that swept in from the North Atlantic. It was a cold that soaked into stone and bone. Her father had been a crofter, a man who built his own world from what the land provided. He built dry stone dikes that stood for centuries without mortar, and he built their small cottage, their black house, with thick stone walls and a roof of turf. She had not been a passive observer. She had been his student. She learned how a wall could breathe. She learned that the greatest defense against the cold was not a solid and impermeable barrier, but a clever and resilient one. Her father used a specific kind of sphagnum moss, dried carefully, to pack the joints in his stonework. "The stone stops the wind," he would tell her, his voice a low rumble in the Gaelic tongue. "But the moss stops the cold. It holds the air still, and still air is warmer than a king's blanket." She remembered watching him, his large, calloused hands working with a surgeon's precision, packing the moss into the gaps. He taught her that mud held water, and water was the cold's ally. But dried moss, and the lichen that grew in similar profusion, was different. It was a matrix of tiny fibers and hollows. It was nature's insulation. She had arrived on the prairie with this knowledge, this memory of a technique born from a different but equally harsh environment. As she saw the settlers fighting the winter with rigidity and force, she knew the better way was to yield, to be flexible, to use a material that worked with the shifting logs, not against them. Her build began not with a shovel, but with a basket. For most of September, while other families were busy laying in their final stores, Alara and her 10-year-old son, Finn, walked the creek beds. She was selective. She ignored the leafy, flat lichens, seeking out the fibrous, bushy types the settlers called old man's beard, and the delicate, branching structures of reindeer moss. She knew these held the most air. They gathered sack after sack, laying the harvest out on canvas sheets to dry in the relentless autumn sun. The sun baked out the moisture, leaving the lichen light springy and almost fluffy to the touch. Then came the application. Yes, it was a slow, laborious process. Other families could chink a cabin in 2 days of hard, messy work. Alara's method took nearly 3 weeks. She would take a large handful of the dried lichen, roll it into a rough rope, and feed it into the gap between 2 logs. Then, using her shaped hickory tool, a sort of flattened, curved paddle, she would begin to pack it in. She didn't just push it, she tamped and wedged it, forcing the material to compress. Her small mallet would strike the end of the packing tool with a series of soft, rhythmic thuds. With each strike, the lichen compressed further, its thousands of tiny fibers locking together. She worked from both the inside and the outside, building up the seal until it was flush with the logs. The final result was not a hard, smooth line of mud, but a textured, grayish seam that felt surprisingly firm, yet yielded slightly under pressure like a wool mattress. It was during the second week of this process that Silas Croft made his first official visit. He wasn't a man given to direct confrontation, but he felt a sense of duty. He had helped her late husband select this plot of land. He had organized the men for the cabin raising after the tragedy. He felt responsible. He dismounted from his horse, his face a mask of fatherly concern. "Mistress MacLeod," he began, his voice gentle but firm. "I don't mean to overstep, but I must speak plainly. This will not work." Alara paused her work, turning to face him. She did not look offended or defensive. She simply waited. "That's just moss," Silas said, gesturing with a thumb towards her wall. "The first good rain will soak it, and the winter freeze will turn it to ice right in your walls. Ice expands, ma'am. It will push your logs apart before January is out. You'll have gaps a man could put his fist through." His argument was sound, based on everything he knew about his world. Water was the enemy. Freezing water was a destructive force. Alara's reply was quiet and direct. "It is dry now. It will stay dry inside the wall." Silas pressed on, convinced he was saving her from a fatal mistake. "Mud and lime, that's what holds. That's what keeps the wind out. It makes a solid barrier. This," he said, poking a finger at a finished seam, which gave way slightly and then sprang back. "This is a nest for mice and insects. It will rot in the spring damp. It's not a proper seal." "It will keep my boy warm," she said. It was not an argument. It was a statement of fact, the bedrock of her entire endeavor. Silas left that day feeling frustrated and deeply worried. His report at the trading post cemented the community's opinion. The woman was touched by grief. Her project was no longer just odd. It was a source of dark amusement, a cautionary tale in the making. They called it Alara's nest. Some said she was trying to build a Scottish bird's nest instead of a human house. The mockery was not loud or cruel to her face, but it was pervasive. It followed her in the averted glances, the pitying smiles, the way other women would offer to share their winter stores with a tone that suggested she would surely need the charity. Through it all, Alara continued her rhythmic tapping. Thud, thud, thud. Each sound was an act of faith, a rejection of their consensus. She was not merely filling gaps. She was engineering a system. And as she finished the last seam, just as the first flurries of snow began to drift from a leaden sky, she knew her work was sound. What the settlers failed to grasp was the profound difference between a filler and an insulator. Mud was a filler. It plugged a hole, but it had a high thermal conductivity, especially when damp. It was a thermal bridge, a highway for heat to escape and cold to enter. Alara's lichen was an insulator. Its effectiveness did not come from its substance, but from its structure. Each strand of dried lichen was a complex fiber. Under a microscope, it would look like a tangled web, a chaotic mesh. The genius of the material was not the material itself, but the space between the fibers. By packing it tightly, Alara was creating millions upon millions of microscopic air pockets. Air, as especially trapped, unmoving air, is one of the most effective insulators on the planet. Heat struggles to travel through it. She hadn't built a solid barrier. She had built a wall of trapped air. This system addressed the two great failings of mud chinking. First, flexibility. When the logs of the cabin inevitably swelled in the damp or shrank in the dry cold, the compressed lichen wall moved with them. It expanded and compressed, maintaining a perfect, airtight seal at all times. Where mud cracked and fell out, the lichen simply adjusted. It was a living gasket. Second, moisture. Silas Croft's prediction of ice was logical, but wrong. The specific lichens Alara had chosen were naturally hydrophobic once fully dried. They resisted absorbing water from the air. Furthermore, the wall could breathe. Any minuscule amount of moisture that did find its way into the seams could also find its way out, preventing the buildup of damp and the subsequent rot or ice formation. A mud wall trapped moisture against the wood. Alara's wall wicketed it away. She hadn't built a dam. She had built a modern, breathable membrane out of the scraps of the forest floor. Her cabin was not a fortress. It was an engine designed for a single purpose: to hold onto warmth. Then December came. It arrived not with a gentle dusting of snow, but with a hard metallic sky and a wind that had a new edge to it. The old-timers felt it in their bones. This was different. The temperature at dawn on the 10th of the month was 14 degrees Fahrenheit, cold but manageable. By sunset, the mercury in the trader's thermometer read -4, as the razor had arrived. By the next morning, it was -20. The wind was a physical force, a constant pressure that made the sturdy log cabins groan. The snow wasn't falling. It was flying horizontally, a blinding sheet of white that erased the world. This was the storm that would later be called the Great Blizzard of '67, a once-in-a-generation event that would become the benchmark for all winters to come. For the settlers in their mud-chinked cabins, the world shrank to the few feet around their stoves. The failure of their walls was immediate and catastrophic. The wind located every flaw, every hairline crack that the autumn sun had baked into the chinking. It blasted through these cracks with the force of a focused jet, creating audible hisses and whistles. Chunks of frozen mud, shrunk by the intense cold, simply dropped from the walls, leaving gaping holes. The battle against the cold became a desperate, losing firefight. Men tried to stuff the holes with rags, with spare canvas, with anything they could find, but the drafts were everywhere. Women fed their fires with a frantic energy, watching their precious woodpiles vanish at a terrifying rate. A stack of wood meant to last a week was gone in a day. When the good oak and hickory ran out, they started burning fence posts, then chairs, than the wooden crates that held their meager possessions. Inside these homes, the cold was a predator. Water froze solid in buckets just 10 feet from a blazing fire. A man who took his gloves off for more than a minute risked frostbite. Families abandoned their separate rooms and beds, dragging their mattresses to the floor around the stove, huddling together under a mountain of blankets and buffalo robes. Even then, the cold seeped in. They were living in a state of siege, trapped and losing ground by the hour. Silas Croft's cabin was the best built in the settlement. The logs were perfectly notched, the foundation secure. He had used the best clay mixture for his chinking, adding a generous amount of lime to strengthen it, and it was failing. He stood in his main room and could see his own breath plume in the air. The north wall was coated in a thick layer of crystalline frost. His wife, Mary, hadn't stopped moving for 2 days, shuttling wood to the stove, her face a grim mask of exhaustion. He had done everything right. He had followed all the rules of construction that he had learned over 30 years of building. And it was not enough. As the wind was making a mockery of his expertise, as he stood there, shivering in his own home, a new and terrible thought began to creep into his mind. He thought of the widow, Elara McLeod. He thought of her foolish, flimsy-looking nest of a cabin. His professional certainty curdled into a cold dread. He had pitied her. Now he pictured her and her young son, alone in that flimsy structure, the wind scouring it clean. The image of her packing that dry moss into the walls, an act he had dismissed as madness, now seemed like a tragic prelude to disaster. He felt a stab of guilt. He had stood by, had offered no real help, secure in his own superior knowledge. What if that knowledge was wrong? What if his pride had allowed him to watch a woman build a tomb for herself and her child? The thought was unbearable. He had to know. If the journey was only 400 yards, but it might as well have been a mile. Silas wrapped himself in every layer he owned, pulling a wool scarf over his face until only his eyes were visible. The moment he stepped outside, the storm hit him like a physical blow. The wind tore the breath from his lungs. The snow was waist-deep, a thick, grinding powder that fought him with every step. He leaned into the wind, a solitary, struggling figure in a world of white chaos. He couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction. He navigated by memory, aiming for the small copse of trees that stood near Elara's cabin. He expected to find a scene of devastation. A cabin half buried in drifts, its chimney dark. He expected silence and death. When he finally stumbled through the trees and saw it, he stopped, confused. And the cabin stood perfectly serene amid the tempest. There were no frantic signs of distress. A thin, almost lazy plume of smoke curled from the chimney stone, a stark contrast to the desperate, roaring columns of black smoke belching from every other chimney in the settlement. It was the smoke of a fire that was calmly warming, not furiously battling. He fought his way to the door, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and a strange, new curiosity. He raised a heavily mittened hand and knocked, the sound swallowed by the roar of the wind. He waited. He was about to knock again, harder this time, when the door swung inward. The first thing that happened was not a sight or a sound. It was a feeling, a wave of warmth, so profound and enveloping. It felt like a physical substance washed over him. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an overdriven stove, but a gentle, steady, humid warmth. It melted the ice from his beard in seconds. He stumbled across the threshold, blinking, disoriented, and then he saw. The scene before him was one of impossible, defiant domesticity. Alara McLeod sat at her loom by the far wall, working the shuttle back and forth. She was wearing a simple wool dress, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. On the rough-hewn floorboards, her son Finn was playing with a set of carved wooden soldiers. He was barefoot. Silas's mind simply refused to process the image. Barefoot, at -32 degrees. A kettle was humming on the small cast-iron stove, which glowed with a gentle, cherry-red heat, not the white-hot fury of his own. A loaf of bread was cooling on a wooden board, its scent filling the small space. He looked at the walls. They were bare wood, clean and dry. There was no frost. There was not a single glittering crystal of ice on the interior logs. The air was still. The roar of the blizzard outside was muted to a distant, powerless whisper. It was as if he had stepped through a portal into another season. He stood there, dripping meltwater onto the floor, a monstrous figure of ice and wool in a bubble of summer. He slowly, numbly pulled off his mittens. His own hands were stiff and aching with cold. He walked to the north wall, the wall that bore the full, unrelenting force of the blizzard. In his own home, that wall was a sheet of ice. He reached out and pressed his bare palm against it. The log was cool, as expected. But then he slid his hand over to the seam, to the thick line of packed lichen. It was not cold. It was not even cool. It was utterly, astonishingly neutral. It felt inert, as if there were nothing on the other side. He pressed his ear to the seam and listened. He could hear nothing. No hiss of wind, no whisper of cold. The seal was perfect. He turned from the wall and looked at the wood box next to the stove. It was, to his amazement, more than 3/4 full. His own wood box, 4 times the size, was nearly empty. The discrepancy was so vast, so utterly outside the bounds of his experience, that it broke the last remnants of his disbelief. This wasn't luck. This wasn't a fluke. This was a system, a science he didn't understand. His voice, when he finally found it, was raspy and low. "How much wood have you burned?" Alara looked up from her loom, her expression calm. "The usual amount," she said simply. "Perhaps a little more today. For the baking." Silas did the math in his head. He had burned through a half-cord of prime oak in less than 3 days. Her consumption, judging by the size of her wood box and the state of her fire, was maybe 1/10 of that. The numbers were undeniable. They were a physical blow. He gestured vaguely around the warm, peaceful room. "The temperature," he stammered. "What is the temperature in here?" She pointed to a small, brass-cased thermometer hanging from a peg. It was an elegant instrument, a relic from whatever life she had lived before this one. Silas stepped closer and peered at it. The needle was steady. 65 degrees. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the storm, that the temperature outside was 32 below zero, a 97-degree differential. It was a technical impossibility. His own cabin, and with a fire that threatened to consume the house itself, was struggling to stay above 20. He backed away from the thermometer and looked at Alara. He looked at her rolled-up sleeves, at her son's bare feet, at the impossibly full wood box. He looked at the wall that had defeated the razor. The evidence was absolute, irrefutable, and it had shattered his entire understanding of the world. He, Silas Croft, the most experienced builder in the territory, the man everyone trusted, was wrong. "I was wrong," he said, the words tasting of ash and awe. "I was completely wrong." He looked at her, his eyes pleading. How? You must show me how." When the great blizzard finally broke after 4 days, the settlement emerged, battered and shaken. The stories that trickled out were of hardship, loss, and near disaster. And 2 families had lost all their livestock. Another man had lost 2 fingers to frostbite while trying to patch his wall. Every family had burned through a month's worth of firewood in a matter of days. And then a different story began to circulate, carried by Silas Croft himself. He told them about the warm cabin. He told them about the barefoot boy and the full wood box. At first, they didn't believe him. But Silas was a man of unimpeachable reputation. His conversion was a more powerful force than any argument. He didn't just tell the story. He explained the principle with the fire and zeal of a new convert. He spoke of trapped air, of flexibility, of a material that worked with the logs instead of fighting them. He took other men, the settlement's leaders, to Alara's cabin. He had them press their hands against the seams, feel the absence of cold, witness the impossible comfort for themselves. The mockery surrounding Alara's nest died overnight. It was replaced by a quiet, profound respect. The name stuck, but its meaning was inverted. It was no longer an insult, but a title of honor, a synonym for warmth and ingenuity. That spring, a new harvest began. It wasn't corn or wheat. Led by Silas, work parties of men, women, and children went out to the creek beds and hollows, gathering fibrous lichen by the wagon load. Alara MacLeod became their teacher. She never sought the role, but she accepted it with a quiet grace. She showed them which types to gather, how to dry it properly, the specific technique of twisting and packing it for the tightest seal. She shared her knowledge as freely as the sun, seeking no payment or fame, yet the transformation of the settlement was swift and total. By the following winter, nearly every cabin had been re-chinked using her method. The change was felt immediately. The constant draining battle against the cold was over. Homes were warmer, drafts were eliminated, and firewood consumption plummeted by an average of 70%. That winter, for the first time, not a single child was lost to pneumonia. The real impact wasn't measured in degrees on a thermometer or cords of wood saved. It was measured in the small, quiet moments of human dignity the warmth allowed. A family able to eat at a table instead of huddled by a stove. A woman able to sew by a window without shivering. A baby sleeping safely in its crib, far from the fire. The technique spread, yet a travelers passing through would remark on the unusual comfort of the cabins, and the settlers, with Silas Croft as their proud spokesman, would explain the genius of Highland chinking. The idea was carried to new settlements, adapted and refined, becoming a part of the local building vernacular. Alara's legacy was not written in books, but in the warm, secure walls of hundreds of homes across the frontier. She had faced down tradition and ridicule not with arguments, but with undeniable empirical proof. The story of Alara MacLeod and her lichen wall is a powerful lesson. It speaks to the danger of dismissing an idea simply because it is unfamiliar. It champions the quiet power of observation and the wisdom that is often carried by those on the margins of a community. The established experts, with their years of experience, and had become blind to the fundamental flaws in their own methods. They saw the world through the lens of tradition. Alara saw it through the lens of physics. Her solution demonstrates a principle that is now at the heart of modern building science. The concept of trapped air as insulation is the basis for everything from fiberglass bats to double-paned windows and spray foam. She had, with materials found on the forest floor, created a high-performance, breathable, flexible wall assembly that outperformed anything else of its time. She didn't invent a new material. She simply saw the profound potential in a material that everyone else had overlooked. If this story of forgotten ingenuity has taught you something new, hit that like button to help spread it to others, and subscribe for more histories of how simple yet brilliant ideas have shaped our world. We have to ask, what is the coldest winter you have ever faced, and what did it teach you? Let us know in the comments below. The account you have just heard is a fictionalized narrative created for educational and entertainment purposes. While the engineering and scientific principles of insulation, thermal mass, and material properties are based on real-world physics and historical building techniques, the characters, specific events, and locations are products of imagination. This story is intended to be an exploration of ideas and should not be taken as a literal historical record or as professional construction advice.